Am I live? Okay, great. Well, thank you for all coming here, and I appreciate Bill letting us use the church here, and Robert, thank you for coming in and handling all the logistics and all that. So, by the way, if you didn't notice on the chair as you came in to your left, it'll be on your right as you go out. I have two handouts. If you don't have one, grab those on your way out, and feel free to give them to other people that might be interested. Is it possible to turn these white lights down a little just to make the screen a little more visible? Just because I know there will be some things that will be hard to see otherwise. If anyone gets a chance to adjust the lights. But great, no, that's better. Okay, thanks. Is there possible that, okay, I don't know if these ones here in the middle here on me, that's good, great. Okay, I think we're good here. Well, anyway, this is a series of talks. I've decided instead of just picking two of them, I'm going to try to do a smaller part of all 5 of the dirty little secrets of evolution. So I'm going to probably skip through a number of slides here just because of the time constraints we have. But there will be time for question and answer. We'll do it halfway and then at the end. So hold your questions till then, and I'd like to get started. So basically, I'd like to start off, why is this an important topic? That there's an attitude that's presented, across society that, evolution, it's a fact. You're an idiot if you don't believe it. And some of it's subtle, but a lot of times it's not subtle at all. And Richard Dawkins, who was one of the leading evolutionists, in one of his main books, that's probably his most popular one, The Blind Watchmaker, he wrote, "It's absolutely safe to say that if you meet someone who claims not to believe in evolution, that person is ignorant, stupid, or insane, or wicked, but I'd rather not consider that." But he wants to put that thought in your mind. So anyway, this is the attitude that comes across in society toward anyone who would even dare question anything about evolution. But what is, and again, there's a philosophy. It's not just science, but there's a lot of stuff behind it. And this is what William Provine, the late professor of biology at Cornell, had to say, which really does summarize the attitude of the evolutionary elite. It says, let me summarize my views. There are no gods, no purposes, no goal of any kind. There is no life after death. There is no ultimate foundation for ethics, no ultimate meaning to life, and no free will for humans. So this is the underlying philosophy that's out there. And Richard Dawkins really summarized it even concisely in one sentence. Darwin, or evolution, made it possible to be an intellectually fulfilled atheist. Because without evolution, it's like, gosh, how did everything get here? There had to be a God or somebody behind it. But oh, now we have evolution. We don't need a God. We can explain it all without him. And interestingly, it's not just pure science that drives a lot of the things that people believe in. As you can see here, if you can't read the sign, it says, "There's probably no God. Now stop worrying and enjoy your life." So basically, if there is no God, there's no one you're accountable to. You can do whatever you want with your life. There's no moral values. There's no sexual restraint. Do whatever you want. Enjoy your life. So there is, a lot of times people will say, well, you have religious reasons to believe there's a God, but people have other motivations to believe in evolution besides pure science. And so one of the things I'd like to get out of the way right off the bat, I am not against evolution because there is a massive amount of evolution that I do believe in. And interestingly, there were mainstream evolutionists have come up with this term microevolution. Now, a lot of evolutionists don't like that. They say, no, there's only one evolution. But even among evolutionists, they agree there's micro and macro evolution. And micro is something I totally accept. It's the study of how things actually work today. It's directly observable, it's measurable, it's testable, you can do repeated experiments, it's objective, and generally, it's universally accepted by all scientists. Because no matter what their religious views or anything like that, if you can do an experiment and show I'm mixing hydrochloric acid with lye, sodium hydroxide, and I get table salt, I can do that experiment 1,000 times. And yes, this poison plus this poison makes table salt, which I can eat. These are things that are reproducible. There's no doubt about that. That's part of science. But evolution, in a sense, there's parts of that are testable and reproducible as well. That includes things like selective breeding that farmers have been doing for centuries. How many of you have dogs? Anybody have a dog here? Okay. Generally, I don't know how they let the rest of you live in Prescott and Prescott Valley. I thought it was mandatory to own a dog here. But anyway, all the breeds of dogs have generally come about in the last few hundred years by human interbreeding of animals. And in fact, even evolutionists admit that all the dog breeds, canine breeds, including wolves and that, were a common species about 10,000 years ago or less. And coyotes, wolves, dogs all came from some common ancestor within the last few thousand years, not millions and millions of years. I believe in natural selection. That basically is survival of the fittest. And if you have an antelope that has 3 legs or has a bad leg, it's not going to survive out in the wilderness. And so it gets eliminated from the population. So natural selection doesn't create anything. It just causes the things that are less fit or less capable of surviving to get eliminated. Genetic mutations. These are things that I worked for many years involved with studying the genetic mutations and their outcomes, how it affects human health, metabolic disorders. These things are stuff we can measure, we can do tests, we can do gene sequencing. So there's no question that this stuff happens, and this is a fact that we know. Basically, mutations are breakdowns in DNA, things going bad, and that is a pure fact, and that's part of microevolution. So, but then there's the other extreme that's I will call macroevolution, and this is Eric Chasen basically said, it's more humbling at first, but then wonderfully enlightening to recognize that evolutionary changes operating over almost incomprehensible space and nearly inconceivable time have given birth to everything around us. Now, I hope you see the difference here. This is not something that's easily testable or reproducible or anything like that. This is totally opposite microevolution. This is saying that everything came about through some processes that happened over vast amounts of time. And this one goes through, basically, they're saying everything evolved from elementary particles into galaxies and stars, into the heavy elements, into the building blocks of life, then into the origin of life itself, and then into intelligence, and finally into society and technology and religion. They say all of this just evolved by naturalistic scientific processes. Now, I'll have to say at this point, just a little bit about me. I was a science nerd in school, and I used to take home chemistry books, and I had built my own chemistry lab in my basement, and while everyone else was watching TV, I would be reading chemistry and physics and evolution books, and I became convinced at a pretty young age, junior high and high school, and through science fiction and that hey, evolution can explain it all. There is no need for a God. And I became an agnostic at first, and then considered myself an atheist, and even argued against some kids in school who were doing a creationist presentation at my high school. But one thing that really bothered me at that time was I was thinking, okay, if there is no God, why isn't there just nothing? That would make total sense, you know. But how do we explain this whole world around us, the complexity and the universe, material and space and time and the laws of chemistry and physics and life itself? How do we explain that? And that just nagged at me, but still I thought, well, evolution will explain it, and eventually I'll come to learn more and more about it. But, so like I say, that was the thing that kept nagging me. Even when I was an atheist, in the middle of the night, I remember waking up and thinking about that. But since that time, I won't get into it how I became a Christian, but then I started to reinvestigate all these evolutionary facts that I had learned in my early years, and I realized that so much of what I thought was a fact really wasn't. And so I came up with this series of talks, and I'm going to give a condensation of all of that today here, what I call the 5 dirty little secrets of evolution. And the first dirty little secret is the Big Bang does not explain the origin of time, space, matter, and energy. The second is evolution has no scientific explanation for the fine-tuning of the universe, meaning the laws of chemistry and physics and things like that. The third is evolution has no scientific explanation for the origin of life. The fourth is modern genetics does not back up the evolutionary tree of life and the evolution of humans from apes. And finally, the fifth one is something that people don't even typically think about, but is actually probably one of the most important ones, but I'll touch a little bit on, is evolution and even science itself has no explanation for human consciousness. When you think about it, that's the most important part of your life is your conscious existence. How is that explained in terms of evolution and just particles? So we'll go into each one of these things. Now, the first one, I'm going to talk about the Big Bang Theory, and not the TV show, which I enjoyed a lot, but we're going to be talking about the actual scientific theory. And so how does this theory come about? Well, we can see the universe through telescopes and see that things are expanding and are moving apart from one another. You may have heard of the term redshift. That means as things move further apart, the light gets shifted to the red through the Doppler effect and things like that. So we know the universe is expanding in every direction. And so what scientists have done is say, okay, we know it's expanding now, so if we go back in time, 1,000 years, a million, a billion, 13.7 billion years, the universe must have been shrinking. If it's going bigger now, if you go in reverse, watch the movie in reverse, everything's shrinking. And eventually, if you keep going farther and farther and farther, it shrinks back into a tiny point, smaller than anything you can imagine. And so that's what they call the cosmic egg that was at the beginning of evolution. Now, how do they know for sure that things went back that far? They don't, but so it's an extrapolation into the distant past. So roughly at 13.79 billion years ago, they say, hey, this is when it all began with the cosmic egg. And so here's kind of an illustration on the far left is, you can't see it, it starts as a microscopic point, and then there's a period called the inflation period, where it's like the explosion. And that was what they call the Big Bang, where suddenly things were smaller than an atom and then grew up almost incredibly fast to the entire size of the universe. And then over time, different things, galaxies, stars develop galaxies, and then finally, at 13.7 billion years, we're here today, and we have the Earth and life and everything else. So the first thing is this cosmic inflation. If there was a Big Bang, that inflation is a really key part of it. What people don't realize, it involves faster than the speed of light expansion of the entire universe. How can that be? Nothing can go faster than the speed of light. Well, space itself was expanding. So you had this huge expansion, and it happened in the first billionth of a second. I mean, a fraction of time, it's like, poof, it suddenly appeared out of nowhere. And so it went to, like I say, a billionth times bigger in just this tiny little fraction of a second, and then bam, it stops. So how did that happen? Why did it, poof, and it's like, it just, we don't need a God, but we just need cosmic inflation, which can instantly pop the entire universe out from nothing in almost no time. So what physical mechanism caused this, and why did it suddenly stop? These are two mysteries, but, so you hear a term, doesn't mean that the term really makes sense. And so then the thing is, so how does the Big Bang explain the structure of the universe, the galaxies, how things are located in space, all of that stuff? You look up through the Hubble telescope, and now we've got this new one. What's the name of the new telescope? Which one? James Webb Telescope. Yeah, so there's going to be some amazing new pictures of things that we just wouldn't have imagined. How does the Big Bang explain all this stuff? Well, it's interesting to explain all the billions of stars and galaxies and things like that we have out there. The Big Bang theory requires that 20 times as much of the stuff out there is invisible energy and is invisible matter. What dark matter is matter you can't see. Dark energy is energy you can't measure. So their theories require massive amounts of stuff to explain the 5%. They're saying 20% of the universe is out there. 95% of it is something we can't even see, but we have to presume it's there in order to explain how this expansion worked. So that's a pretty big assumption right there. And how do you disprove that this dark matter and dark energy don't exist? Because you say, I can't see it, I can't measure it. And they say, exactly. That's why it's black, dark matter and dark energy. So one of the other things is that this explosion, normally when you do an explosion, it's sort of chaotic. More stuff may go in one direction and less over here and that. But the Big Bang supposedly made this universe, which is what they call a flat universe. It's balanced in so many ways at such massive levels. And so one of the calculations was that this explosion had to be uniform to 1 part in 10 to the 60th. That's a one followed by 60 zeros. It's a massive, it's billions of billions of billions of billions of billions. It had to be that precise. It turns out that means if somebody had flicked in 1 extra grain of sand into the cosmic egg, or took 1 grain of sand out of it, we would not have the perfect universe that we have today. That's how precisely tuned the amount of matter in the Big Bang was. And another thing is, David mentioned a little bit about the laws of thermodynamics. Back in the day when I took physics, and I'm sure when you took physics as well, they're the two laws of the first and second law of thermodynamics are the most solidly established laws of science we have. The first law is that matter and energy can neither be created nor destroyed, but they can only be interconverted from one form to the other. And the second law is the amount of available free energy that can do stuff is always going down. And so basically that's saying order is going down and disorder or entropy is always increasing. So these are two things that we've observed and we know as facts from everything we've studied on Earth here. So how does that fit in with the Big Bang? Well, going to, first of all, the second law, how things are running down. If it's like a clock that you wind up in the old days with a spring-loaded clock, you wind it up and it's running down. So if you walk in a room and a clock is still ticking and it's a spring-loaded, you know somebody had to have wound it up. So the question is, if that clock has been going for a long time, it had to have been wound up really hard to make it keep running today. So how can the universe have still as much energy as it does now, 13.7 billion years after the Big Bang? That means that the amount of initial order had to have been so wound up and so compressed, it's incredibly well ordered. And in fact, Roger Penrose, who's a great physicist and evolutionist, he calculated that the order of the Big Bang was so precise at 1 part in 10 to the 10th power to the 123rd power. That's a 1 followed by, well, let's see, how do I do this? 10 to the 123rd, the number of zeros is so large you couldn't even write it using all the matter of the energy or of the universe. If every proton was a 0, you still don't have enough zeros to write a number how accurately and how compressed the Big Bang was. So this precision is better than being off by 1 proton in a trillion universes. That's how finely ordered the universe had to have been at the Big Bang to make the universe we have today. Something that's really incredible to believe. How could that have happened? No explanation how that occurred. And so finally, we get to the issue is, why is there a cosmic egg at all? You know, why don't we have nothing? The question I had, why is there something rather than nothing? Or why isn't there just nothing? Well, Stephen Hawking said, because he's the famous, the late physicist who was a brilliant man, because there is a law such as gravity, the universe can and will create itself from nothing. That's his theory from it. Well, many philosophers and physicists and that have said, basically, this is just gibberish. I mean, Stephen Hawking was a brilliant man when it comes to mathematics, but a law of gravity is a description of how gravity works with real objects. A law can't bring anything into existence. Does that make sense? You know, just because you can describe how the sun and the earth attract each other, that's the law of gravity, you can write equations. But if you just have the law, but no sun and no earth, it's not going to bring them into existence. So what he's saying there, spontaneous creation, is just a belief in a miracle. So it's one of the things that's kind of interesting there. It's not necessary to invoke God. You just have to believe that gravity can somehow create things on its own. And the interesting thing is, that didn't answer the question, why isn't there just nothing? Why is there a law of gravity? You know, that's the kind of thing. He doesn't explain that. And another person, Lawrence Krauss, who actually, he was from Cleveland area, where I originally was from. Then he moved here to Arizona, which is where I am now. But he's retired now. But he wrote a book, A Universe from Nothing, that, hey, that answers my question, is how do we have something rather than nothing? But basically, all his book does, you can condense it down to one thing. If you redefine nothing as actually being what he calls a quantum fluctuation that is capable of spitting particles into existence at any time, well, then that explains it. But the reality is, he hasn't, by redefining nothing to meaning it's something, he still hasn't defined where did the quantum fluctuation come from and all the precise laws that he's presuming that enable universes to pop into existence. He's just just doing some really poor philosophy and logic and saying, well, nothing isn't really nothing. And it's like, no, that doesn't really explain how something came from nothing. So in conclusion, you get to the point, if you accept the Big Bang, you have to believe that the entire universe was once infinitesimally small. There was the sudden, faster-than-light inflation of the universe, that there's 20 times more unseen energy and matter than there is visible matter and energy, that the explosion was perfectly fine-tuned to 1 part in 10 to the 60th, and that the high initial order was 1 part in 10 to the 10 to the 123rd. All these things are part of the Big Bang Theory. None of these things are proven, and most of them are just highly unbelievable and just really very difficult for people who understand the theory. How can they accept this with a straight face? I don't know. But even apart from all that, they still don't explain how all this came from absolutely nothing. They still start with the cosmic egg, and they really don't really seriously try to explain how that cosmic egg got there. And at this point, I would like to propose, you're here to hear this, I think there could have been a cosmic chicken that is responsible for the cosmic egg. So that would explain it all neatly. But I haven't yet published yet. It could be coming very soon. So now we'd like to move on to, there we go. So now I'd like to move on. So we talked about just the universe as a whole, nothing particular about it. So how do we explain galaxies and planets and mountains and grass and oceans and things? And then even at the top, that looks like my little dog, Cozy, except that's a cuter, friendlier. Mine is kind of not so friendly, but kind of old now. How does all this, the details of the universe get in? And this is what I like to call the fine-tuning argument. And evolution has no scientific explanation for why the universe is so finely tuned for life the way it is. And so how does evolution explain the laws of physics and chemistry that make all of this possible? And another way of referring to this is the Goldilocks enigma. Here's a picture from the original 1918 Mother's Nursery Tales. And but you've all heard the story of Goldilocks. You know, the one bed was too hard and the other was too soft and too big. And finally, the little baby's bear's bed was exactly right. And so Goldilocks lay down and fell asleep. So it was exactly right. And that's basically, we live in a Goldilocks universe that is exactly right to support life, just like you and me. It's a pretty amazing thing we take for granted, but it didn't have to be that way. So getting back to Stephen Hawking, who said there is no need for God, the law of gravity can explain it all. But he also admitted this. He said the laws of science, as we know them at present, contain many fundamental numbers like the size of the electric charge of the electron and the ratio of the masses of the proton and electron. The remarkable fact is that the values of these numbers seem to have been very finely adjusted to make possible the development of life. These numbers, the relationships, the laws of physics, are very precisely tuned or adjusted to allow the world and life as we know it. So some of the things, I won't get into a lot of the details, but since we have a physicist here, I will have to mention a few of them here. You know, the speed of light we talked about. And I don't want to get a whole lot into it, but I think for the most part, the speed of light, I mean, you can measure it in a variety of ways. It seems pretty constant, and it affects so many things that I don't see that it's likely to have changed, at least in any observable time. But it's around 299,000 kilometers per second, or 186,000 miles an hour. So the magnetic constant, things about how magnetism works. The electric charge, what is the charge on an electron? And there's an exactly equal but opposite charge on the proton. That's a constant that holds everywhere. The electron mass, how heavy is an electron? How heavy is a proton? And it's interesting, I'll talk a little bit about this, but every proton, you know, you've seen the models of the atoms, like hydrogen has one proton and then one electron going around. Carbon has 6 protons, 6 neutrons, and 6 electrons. Every proton is exactly 1,836.15267245 times heavier than every electron. That's in your body, everywhere in the universe. That number, that ratio holds everywhere. It's not evolving, it stays the same. And there's another 20 or so different independent constants about all kinds of things that make no sense to me. I'm a biochemist, not a physicist, so I don't even know what half of these electromagnetical and other gravitational constants are. So, and then there's things like the fundamental forces of gravity, electromagnetism, which explains how computers and radio and TV and all these kind of things work. The strong and weak nuclear forces, how atoms hold together and have the exact composition and properties that they do, all depend on these laws, which have precise values that describe these relationships. For example, gravity, we know it's able to cause stars to form into galaxies and hold us on the planet. But it's interesting, if gravity were even could be an infinite range, if it were even a few times more powerful, you would have such strong gravity that everything would be sucked into black holes. You know, you wouldn't have anything being able to exist in the state that we know it. It would just be so strong that gravity would suck it in. Or if gravity were weaker, you wouldn't have stars form. You wouldn't have planets form. You'd just have a diffuse universe filled with gas. And as far as you go, it'd just be an infinite gaseous universe that never collapsed to form stars or planets. So we just take for granted that gravity is just the precise value to enable a universe like the one we have. Another thing, I won't get, and I don't understand all the details of how the strong and weak nuclear forces work, but it gives us, who knows what this is? Anybody? Periodic chart, yes. For the chemists out there, this is now getting into my field. This is all the basic elements, and there's a few more at the end that they made in various cyclotrons and stuff that exist for millionths of seconds or so. But these are the basic 92 elements, and then a few others that have been made by humans that define everything we see around us. Carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, silver, gold, all these kind of things are basic things that are formed. And the properties of these are totally dependent on the exact ratios of the strong and weak nuclear forces and the electromagnetic forces and all those things. They have to have the precise values they have to give us this chemical chart, which has the amazing properties of being able to have life the way it is. And I love this talk. I can go along into all kinds of details of how many millions of compounds can form from carbon. But if carbon was even the slightest difference in had the electric charge of an electron or the masses of the protons and neutrons, you wouldn't be able to form carbon compounds with billions of atoms in them, which we need for life to exist. And in fact, if some of the strong and weak nuclear forces were a little weaker, you would only have a periodic chart with one element. You just might have hydrogen. You could never form any bigger atoms at all. And if it was different, you might have a totally different periodic chart than what we have today. Another thing I'd like to mention, getting back to, you have protons, neutrons, and electrons, which are the three primary particles. And protons and neutrons, interesting. Protons, neutrons, and electrons, the three basic particles of ordinary matter. And protons and neutrons each have three quarks that make them up. And so those things, notice the trinity in that. It's kind of interesting how that works out. But one of the things about it is that the charge of, like I mentioned, or the weight of a proton is 1,836.152673 times bigger than every electron. And the thing about this is, why is it that it's that precise ratio? It's not evolving. And even back 150 years ago, James Clerk Maxwell, who was one of the greatest physicists of the time, who came up with a lot of the laws of electromagnetism, which are the basis of all our machinery and radio and things like that came afterwards, and your computers and all that kind of stuff are based on things that this guy figured out in the 1800s. He wrote this around the time of Darwin because he was a Christian and he did not accept evolution. And this is an excellent argument that, with minor variation, is totally true today. He said, no theory of evolution can be formed to account for the similarity of molecules, for evolution necessarily implies continuous change, and the molecule is incapable of growth or decay, of generation or destruction. None of the processes of nature since the time when nature began have produced the slightest difference in the properties of any molecule or any proton or any electron. We are therefore unable to ascribe their existence to the operation of any of the causes which we call natural. And this is the part I like at the end, that he wrote this 150 years ago. On the other hand, the exact equality of each molecule or of each proton or of each electron to all others of the same kind gives it, as Sir John Herschel, another Christian who was a scientist, has well said, the essential character of a manufactured article. So this is one of those things when saying, well, everything's evolving. Wait a minute, every proton, every neutron, every electron, they are like manufactured articles, like Tinker Toys or Legos. They're exactly the same everywhere in the universe. So next time you look out at the sky and you see all these distant stars or things like that, or look at a picture, remember this number, 1,836. You know, you don't have to remember all the decimal points, but every hydrogen atom at the farthest point of the galaxy has a proton that's 1,836 times bigger than its electrons. And in your brain, if you take a drop of water from out of the center of your brain and look at it's 1,836.1526 everywhere in the universe. That is an amazing thing that disproves evolution of matter. So it's how does evolution explain that? They just kind of glide over that and never talk about it. And so not only, like I say, there's the few things I mentioned, speed of light and all this stuff, there's at least 20 different fundamental things. All of them had to be precisely tuned. And this crowd here, most of you understand these old analog radio tuners. If I do a talk like this to kids in high school, have any of you ever seen one of these? You know, they don't even know. No, it's like, what do you mean push button? Oh, then we had the push buttons, and it's like, you know, that still. And if you ever were driving on a highway and you know what it was like trying to tune the station in as you were getting competing stations coming in. It's a lost art. Nobody knows how to do that anymore. So, but the universe is more finely tuned than any radio station, and we've got all of these things that are fine-tuned to one another to allow for life. So how do scientists explain this miraculous fine-tuning of all these values? Basically, they say, well, maybe there's an infinite number of universes, and everyone is different, and we just happen to be in the lucky one. So they have no explanation at all. They just say, you know, there's an infinite number of universes. We have evidence for only one. There's nothing out there that we can detect or see. That's pure philosophy and speculation. If you're sticking to science, we only have one universe. So it's interesting, rather than believing in one unseen creator who made everything with the precise laws that we have, they would rather believe in an infinite number of unseeable universes that somehow created themselves. So all this, if you don't accept that there is a creator or a designer behind it, this is what you basically have to believe. And that clearly is not science. It's a religion of its own. And so now let me take a break. I'm going to go, just a second, let me get a sip of water here. And let's see, okay, we're doing pretty well. I'm going to talk for just a few more minutes. I'll go partway through this, and then we'll have our intermission. And we'll finish up. So this is the third dirty little secret. And now this is getting more into my area of expertise as a biochemist, which is dealing with the chemistry of living things. So I claim that evolution provides no scientific evidence for the origin of life. So the question basically is exactly what evidence is there from science that life really evolved from a non-living chemical soup? We have life, and evolution says once there was no life. How did that first living cell get started? And Carl Weiss, who is a biochemist, wrote this back in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science, top science journal. He says, the evolution of modern cells is arguably the most challenging and important problem the field of biology has ever faced. And here, this is to emphasize how critical this is. The origin of proteinaceous cells, meaning the kind of cells that we have that contain protein in them, the origin of these cells that we see in all living things is the most important single event in evolutionary history. And it really is true. How did life get started? Because if it never got started, the rest of evolution doesn't matter. How did that first living cell get started? And so back then when Darwin, was doing his things, they had very crude microscopes. I mean, they were still pretty amazing, and they could see cells that were blobs. It was just a blob of protoplasm. And Darwin speculated, well, maybe a spark somewhere in a pond got the first, little bits of protein or stuff, got the first cell started somehow, given enough time. Given enough time, anything can happen. That's basically the mantra of evolution. Well, we know today that a cell is not a blob of just a sack of protoplasm, which is just a little glob. Every type of cell has extremely complex structures. And in eukaryotic cells, you have nucleuses which have all kinds of complex systems within them. You have all kinds of different mitochondria and things like that. And even simple bacteria cells have massive amounts of complexity in them. Well, getting back to how do we even explain this? Most of you have probably seen this picture in the middle of the Miller-Urey experiment, where there's Stanley Miller and Harold Urey. Miller was the graduate student, and Urey was his advisor. They did an experiment where they sealed this apparatus and they put in ammonia, water, and carbon dioxide or methane, and then they sealed it up and heated the bottom, and it flowed through and cooled it at the other end so it would cycle through, and then they put electric sparks through to simulate lightning. And given enough time, voila, in the liquid that they collected, after running it for several days and weeks, and they've run them for months and years since then, you find amino acids getting formed, which are the building blocks of life, you've probably heard many times. Because amino acids are basically, there's 20 different kinds, and a few exceptions here and there I won't get into, but there's 20 different of these amino acids, which are chemicals that connect together like beads on a string, like a necklace. So one amino acid, you have 20 different colors of beads or 20 different shapes of beads, and you can connect these in as long of a chain as you would like. And so you can use, glycine could be the first one, and histidine could be the second one, and phenylalanine. And if you connect these long enough, you'll have a protein. And proteins typically have 100 to 30,000 or more of these specific amino acids in a specific sequence on a chain. Well, interestingly, when they ran their Spark and created amino acids, they've never been able to create all of these 20 amino acids. Plus, they created far more junk, other kinds of amino acids that are not part of any living thing, all kinds of other toxic chemicals which would be poisons to life. You don't hear about that kind of stuff. But if a scientist filters them out, you can get some, or in fact, I think through a variety of experiments under different conditions, they've made over half of these. So anyway, so they've been able to make some, but to claim that, hey, we've got the building blocks of life so we can show how life evolved, they've barely even scratched the surface of what's needed, as you'll see. So as I mentioned, they can form long chains, 600. Some of the proteins in your muscle have over 30,000 amino acids in the precise sequence, which enables, all motions in animals and birds and things like that. It's amazing. And if those sequences are off, the protein won't work correctly in most cases. And like I say, one of the other things that's interesting is the number of possibilities of getting things wrong is immense. If I told you right now, I'm thinking of 3 amino acids out of those 20, who wants to take a guess? Well, how many possibilities are there? The first one could be one of 20. The second one could be any of the other of the 20, and the third one could be any of the 20. So the number of ways of even doing a 3-long peptide, they would call it, a tripeptide, would be 20 times 20 times 20. There's 8,000 ways of just making one that's only 3 long. If you talk about a small protein, which is 100 amino acids, it's 20 times 20 times 20, 100 times 10 to the 20th power. It comes 20 to the 100th power. That comes out to a number 10 followed by 130 zeros. That's more than all the particles of the universe. And that's just a way of making one small protein. So the ways of making it correctly are very small. The ways of getting it wrong are vast. And one of the things about proteins, they're not just strings of beads like you picture a string of beads that's just laying there. They have amazing properties. They're what we call, at least a large number of proteins, or most of the ones in your body, are called catalysts and are enzymes. And an enzyme is a protein catalyst, and a catalyst is something that makes a reaction occur that would not otherwise occur at all or would occur very slowly. For example, there's a chemical reaction here that converts aridine, and it takes a carbon dioxide off it. And if you had some aridine molecules just sitting in a bit of water at room temperature, it would take 78 million years on average for this to happen by itself. But with this enzyme, it happens, I don't know if I give the exact time it is, it's a fraction of a second, but it happens 100,000 trillion times faster. It happens in a fraction of a second. So it speeds up reactions that would normally take infinitely long. You could not have a living organism that had to wait 78 million years for this thing to react on its own. And you have over 3,000 different types of enzymes in your body that are doing all different kinds of things, digesting your food, building back the proteins that to make your cells grow and to help correct things and do all kinds of activities within your body, what we call metabolism. So one of the things about these chains of beads, though, they don't just stay as a long chain. Because of the properties of the individual amino acids, some are positive charged, some are negative, some attract water, some repel water. They fold up into a sort of a various sized globs, but they're very precise structures. And because they fold precisely because of the exact amino acid sequence, then they can have certain parts of the protein forming what's called an active site where chemicals can react. And this is the amazing thing of these proteins. By taking those same 20 amino acids, you can form thousands of different kinds of enzymes that can do thousands of different chemical reactions, which is required for a living organism to stay alive. And so what is this coming after? We're talking about cells. Does anybody know what this is? Hoover Dam. Good. It's not Glen Canyon, it's the Hoover Dam. So it was a miracle in its time. But what does a dam do? Pardon my language there. But the Hoover Dam, or any kind of dam like it, it takes the pressure of water that's backed up on the upside of the dam, and as the water is allowed to flow to the lower level, it has tremendous energy potential. And that energy potential, what does it do? It drives fans, massive turbines. And as the water goes through, it's basically a fan blade that's turning, and as that turns, it generates electricity, which I imagine a fair percent of the electricity here is coming from Glen Canyon or Hoover Dam or something like that. So it's something that humans, it's one of the great modern inventions of how we've been able to use water to produce energy. But guess what? In your cells, we had this going long before that. So this is actually one of the most amazing enzymes. It's called ATP synthase. And in a second here, we'll do an animation just to show you a little bit about it. But within your body, you have a chemical called ATP. And it's basically a little chemical battery. It has energy. And almost all the reactions in your body use ATP to make things happen. But once ATP gets used, it spits off a phosphate and now becomes ADP, which is like a dead battery. And so now you've got these little batteries that have energy. As soon as they get used, they're dead. They need to be recharged, just like a rechargeable battery. And so this molecule, ATP synthase, is the recharger of ATP, your battery recharger in your cell. What's amazing is this thing spins around 700 times a second and charges to over 2,000 ATPs every second. And what's interesting is the amount of ATP you need is 100 to 150 pounds, 110 to 160 pounds a day. If you didn't have this enzyme, you would have to eat up to 150 pounds a day of this white ATP powder just to keep your body going. But as it turns out, you only have 2 to 3 ounces of it in your body, but it's continually being recharged by this enzyme. And you have over 300 million trillion of these little things spinning around in your body continually throughout the day that recharge things. This is just miraculous. And it's interesting, you don't see this often in scientific literature, but in the article describing this that I read in Annual Reviews of Biochemistry said, this is the most beautiful, the most unusual and important enzyme. I mean, you don't hear the words beautiful and things like that in science, except this truly is. And I don't know, is Robert back there? I don't know. If you could quickly run over to that animation. I'll just show you this for a few seconds here. Go ahead. This is the cell membrane.
It's been called one of the wonders of the molecular world, an amazing nanoscale machine. ATP synthase is a high-tech micromolecular power generator inside the cells of your body. It generates adenosine triphosphate, or ATP, an energy molecule that provides fuel that every one of your cells needs to function. Without this fuel, your cells will cease operation, and so will you. ATP synthase works like a rotary engine. The barrel-shaped rotator is composed of 10 to 15 protein parts called subunits. The rotator spins around, transmitting mechanical energy into the drive shaft of the machine, which helps make ATP. This drive shaft has a specially placed bump that opens and closes parts as the drive shaft spins around. This bump opens special protein subunits on the bottom of the machine.
Thanks, that's good. You can stop that there and go back to the presentation. But that, as you see those proteins there, those are made up of those beads of amino acids. They're not actually solid things. It's these chains of proteins that all these different subunits are made of precise sequences of different proteins. And then there's a whole system of how it gets put together properly. They don't just happen like that. It's an amazingly complex thing. So, but this is going on in your body every time. So like you say, if you feel dizzy every now and then, it's because you've got all the spinning going on inside of you. So, and like I say, this Discovery Institute is the one that produced this little animation. If you go to their website, discovery.org, there'll be links to the YouTube, or you could search on YouTube for Discovery Institute ATP synthase. It's a pretty cool animation. But now I'd like to get to something. We talked about one enzyme or a couple of them, but at the end, if you get a chance to come up, I have this chart here. Can you all read the details from where you're sitting there? Okay. So I'll have some slides to that. But this chart shows about 1,000 enzymes and how they interconnect, and one enzyme reacts on chemical A to convert it to B, and another one converts B to C, or another one converts B to D. And they interact and form chains and cycles and all kinds of things that enable life to exist. And even the simplest bacteria has at least 1,000 enzymes. So this chart here is basically the description of the chemistry and even the simplest of bacteria. So I'm going to zoom in, like I say, can you all read that? Okay, let me zoom in a little. Okay, now I'm in the red. And it's still hard. This is like a tiny little postcard size portion of this chart. But it just shows how one chemical converted by one enzyme to a different chemical. And if one little thing is wrong in that enzyme or the protein that does the reaction, it can cause serious problems. In fact, I mentioned I worked in testing babies for genetic diseases. There's a disease called PKU, phenylketonuriase. And in fact, if you drink Diet Coke or Diet Pepsi on the bottom, you'll see a thing, warning, phenylketonuria contains phenylalanine. And you think, what the heck is that? For 99% of us, or 99.9, we don't care at all. But if you're 1 in 4,000 or so babies that are born with this disease, where you have even one amino acid in that protein, phenylketonuria, I'm trying to remember the name off the top of my head, but the enzyme that's involved in this one step, you cannot break down phenylalanine. And so it builds up in your brain, and within a matter of months to years, it causes severe and irreversible mental retardation. And so now we test every baby that's born, and those that have this, we can't fix the disease right now, but we can treat it by giving them only food without too much phenylalanine. So they cannot eat protein, they cannot drink milk, they cannot eat cheese. They are on a very restricted diet that's very low in phenylalanine, but then they can lead a normal life. They will have a normal brain because their body can't break down phenylalanine, so we just make sure they don't get only the bare minimum that they need, and then they can lead a normal life. And actually, once they become an adult, then they can eat more phenylalanine because then their brain is formed and they don't have the bad effects from that. So this is an amazing thing how all these reactions work. Whoop, hopefully, there we go. So like I say, this biochemical pathways is just actually, it is as complicated as it looks. It's a gross simplification because there's all kinds of things called activators, there's inhibitors, in every cell of our body, we have a different series, a slightly different version of these pathways going on. So it gets incredibly complex when you talk about animals and birds and things like that. So it's just, and even in different phases of development, it changes. But another way, even though you're not going to understand this, and it really dwarfs an automobile schematic. This is really more complex than that. But another way to view it is how all these things interconnect. How many of you heard of Rube Goldberg? At least some of us who are older. He's got the great cartoons. You've seen things like this where somebody throws a bucket of water in a window and the guy grabs for his umbrella, which pulls a pulley, which causes a weight to fall, that causes a mallet to hit a metal thing that wakes up a little crying animal, and the mother animal rocks it in the crib, and then it causes the back scratcher to work. So it's like a whole series of one thing causes this, and it's just, once it happens, it's done, and you have to recharge it and that. So Rube Goldberg had hundreds of these crazy machines, and they're just hilarious to look at. But that's essentially what this is. You've got all this chemical makes a little too much here, which now it activates another enzyme to do something else over here, which is that, and there's feedback loops. It's the most complex Rube Goldberg machine that's continually operating your entire life. It's just miraculous. And with that, we're going to take an intermission, but I will stop for if there's a couple questions about what I've talked about so far. We could do that. Yes, in the back. I'm sorry? Okay, so we're live again. And by the way, I forgot to tell you, there will be a quiz on this chart at the end. So the question is, we have this amazing order within living organisms, these thousands of enzymes that fit these amazing patterns of life. And we were in the middle of talking about how did that first cell evolve. But this, as overwhelming as this incredible complexity of the living cell, you get to the other question is, well, how does the cell know how to make all this stuff? And that's where we get into the second aspect of the difficulty of the origin of life. Anybody know what this is here? It says it's an E. coli, but what's all that little white stuff out there? That's the DNA that was inside of that bacterial cell. And as you can see, what they did, lysing it, they put it in like a soapy solution that causes the outer cell membrane to leak. And so all that squiggly stuff that was outside of it is the DNA that was squeezed into the inside of that cell. And the DNA is the instructions for how to make these proteins, how to put those amino acids in the precise, that string of beads that we talked about. How do you know which is the first bead and the second and the 180th and the 250th? That's all encoded in the DNA. And so DNA is interesting. It is actually a true code. There's 4 chemical compounds which we call the DNA bases, or the code letters A, C, G, and T, which stands for the chemical names of that. I won't get into it. And then the DNA can form long chains of these 4 bases, A, C, G, and T, millions and even billions of chemical bases long. It's the largest molecules we know in the world. And then they can also curl around each other and form a double helix, which adds sort of a background safety check, sort of an automatic backup of everything. So in case something gets damaged, you have a backup copy that can be used to repair your initial copy. And I won't get a whole lot into the genetic code, but that's a mysterious thing of its own. And you've heard the term mutation before, genetic mutations or genetic damage. That's if one of the letters or more of the letters gets changed to a different letter accidentally because of cosmic rays or radiation or chemical reactions or chemical mutagens, things like that, can cause changes in the DNA, which we call mutations. And there's all kinds of possible mutations that can happen. So these are the pictures of the 4 DNA bases, which we have adenine, guanine, cytosine, and thymine. They have the blue part is the base, and then they have different side chains that make them different. So chemically, they're not a whole lot different from one another, but they're distinct enough that your body can use them to create codes and patterns that it can recognize and decipher. And then, like I mentioned, it has a double helix, which enables it to be its own backup copy and also allows reproduction when one strand separates off to one child cell and the other one goes to the other, and then they can recreate themselves, and now you have 2 cells where there originally was only 1. And this is the basis of the genetic code. It's really, I can't even get into this, but this is a mystery today. Why do we have this genetic code? Because it implies that there's an intelligence that's deciphering the DNA and how to make the protein. How this code evolved, evolutionists have no explanation of how something like that could have possibly taken place. And the whole concept of DNA to RNA to protein, could be a whole course in biology in 8th or 9th grade or even college level, that you have a DNA strand at the upper left, and then there's all kinds of these protein molecules that say, hey, I need enzyme phenylalanine hydroxylase. And it has ways of going to that exact point on this long strand of DNA and says, copy me the section that has the code for this enzyme. It makes a messenger RNA. That comes out of the nucleus, goes to a ribosome, which is the protein factory. And then the transfer RNA, which breaks down the genetic code, reads that little messenger RNA and makes the protein that they need and makes as many copies as they need and all that kind of stuff. This is all incredibly amazing. I mean, that enzyme animation that I showed of the ATP synthase, this overwhelms it in the complexity of what's going on here. But this is happening continually in your body throughout the day as your body's making new proteins for this. If suddenly today for lunch you go out and you have a sandwich which has more fat in it that you normally eat, your body's going to say, hey, I need more protein to break down the fat, and it's going to trigger a whole cycles of creating more proteins and things like that. It's just, all this happens automatically through those Rube Goldberg type feedback mechanisms, which is just mind-boggling. So, and this is just some other stuff about the DNA. But so when we talk about the evolution of life, that first cell, here's what a simple cell like E. coli can consist of. It has 4,000 genes that code and 115 RNA molecule genes. It has 4.5 billion DNA letters that contain the information on how an E. coli functions. And it's just a little ellipse, a little oval-shaped microscopic cell, so small you can't see it unless you have a really, really powerful microscope. It has that much information in it. And again, it not only knows how to make the individual proteins, but it knows when to make them, how much to make, when to stop making them, all these kind of things. And it knows how to make copies of itself. And so Richard Dawkins is, again, getting back to him, he's one of the big evolutionists who's probably the most well-known person promoting evolution. Here, this is from his book, The Greatest Show on Earth, which he wrote in 2009. It says, evolution is a fact, beyond reasonable doubt, beyond serious doubt, beyond sane informed doubt, beyond doubt, evolution is a fact. Did you get that? There's no doubt, it's a fact. If it didn't have to be true, but it is. We know this because of a rising flood of evidence. Evolution is a fact, and this book will demonstrate it. No reputable scientist disputes it, and no unbiased reader will close this book doubting it. So this is at the beginning of his book. It's like, wow, he's sort of, how dare I even question stuff? So this is at the beginning of the book. At the end of the book, we have no evidence about what the first step in making life was, but we do know the kind of step it must have been. It must have been whatever it took to get natural selection started. Very scientific, that convinces me. Here's the thing, in the beginning, you'll have no doubt. No one can doubt this. No serious scientist. We have no evidence. We have no idea what it was. We don't even have a clue of how that first cell was. And that means that the key step was the arising by some process as yet unknown of a self-replicating entity. So let me ask you this. Do you have any reason to doubt evolution? Yes, because this is the most important part of it. How did life start? Here's another one. Jerry Coyne, Why Evolution is True. Right off the beginning, here's the reason why evolution is true. The most important part, how did life start? Here's what he writes. Over the first 80% of the history of life, all species were soft-bodied, so we have only a foggy window into the earliest and most interesting developments in evolution, and none at all into the origin of life. This is Jerry Coyne, again in 2009, just about 10 years ago. We have no idea at all how life started. And these are why evolution is true. We have no evidence at all how this complexity that we see here started. So those are the kind of things that they'll be blustering, saying there's no doubt, no scientist doubts this, but it's only on page 195 or 284 that they say we have no evidence, we have no idea. I guess they're trusting people will never finish their book. So anyway, for the origin of life, that evolution claims that it's started by random chemical processes, unguided, no need for a god, just natural chemistry. There's no clue how the simple proteins were created. No clue how even a few DNA bases were made. They've never made a DNA base by that Miller-Urey experiment where they sent sparks through stuff. They've never been able to make DNA that way, and they've never been able to make chains of DNA all by themselves. No clue how the genetic code was originated, which is used in every living organism. No clue as to what the first cell was like. Did it have protein? Did it have DNA? Did it have RNA? No one has any guesses or any specific scientific ideas at all. So 160 years after Darwin, scientists are still completely unable to give any explanation of how that very first self-replicating living organism came into existence from non-living chemicals. And so that was the dirty little secret number 3. And now we're going to get into number 4, which is, again, one I think people find very interesting, that modern genetics does not back up the evolutionary tree of life or the evolution of humans from apes. Let me get back. So on the left was actually a chart, a tree of life. You can barely see it. That was, I think, one of Darwin's notebooks or in one of his first editions of The Origin of Species. And on the right hand, you've probably seen hundreds of different versions of the tree of life where you have a bacteria at the bottom and then fungi, and off one side, plants go off and evolve into all the different kinds of conifers and different kinds of trees and plants and flowers. And on the left side, then you get into sponges and eventually into fish and reptiles and birds. And finally, at the top somewhere, you'll find, often they'll put Charles Darwin at the top, representing humankind. So anyway, supposedly this tree of life, everything from one cell through gradual mutations, we all trace our way back somehow to that original bacteria or a couple bacteria that were the first living organisms that we don't have any clue of how they formed. So, and interestingly, all these things of the tree of life are just because this thing looks like this or this thing looks like that. This is Richard Dawkins on the left, and I don't know how many of you know Emma Watson from Harry Potter, but just because there are similarities in hairstyle or facial appearance doesn't mean there's any relationship at all. And that's the same way with a lot of things in the tree of life. Just because things look together doesn't necessarily mean they have a common ancestor. So what does genetics tell us about the tree of life and that? So you may hear claims that the DNA similarities prove the tree of life. We can look at the DNA and prove that this tree of life that we've been talking about for 100 years is exactly the way it is. And you may have heard, how many have heard of junk DNA? This is a term that's been in use for, 30 or 40 years now, that most of the DNA in organisms is a useless relic of unguided evolutionary random chance processes. And that came about because only 3% of the human DNA actually codes for proteins. So 97% doesn't code for proteins. And, well, I don't know what it does. Let's call it junk. And it fits our premise that evolution is just randomly doing stuff, and every now and then it hits on something useful, and then the rest of it's just junk. That harmless junk, but junk nonetheless. And then finally, you may have heard chimps and humans were 99% identical, which basically proves we had to evolve from one another. So has evolution confirmed the tree of life? Here's Kevin Peterson, who looked at microRNA genes, which are in all kinds of organisms, and it's just a particular type of DNA sequence, and you can compare how similar organisms are to one another. He said, I've looked at thousands of microRNA genes, different kinds of genes, and I can't find a single example that would support the traditional evolutionary tree. Because if you look at enzyme or microRNA number 1, it shows one tree. MicroRNA 2, it shows things have different similarities. MicroRNA 3 shows a different one. You don't, if these things truly all did evolve, you would expect all of these would back each other up. If evolution happened and there is a tree of life, all of these things should have evolved along the same tree pattern, but we don't see that. Another researcher using 2,000 genes from a diverse group of animals, the problem was that different genes told contradictory evolutionary stories. The genes were sending mixed signals. Roughly 50% had one evolutionary history and 50% another. We've just annihilated the tree of life. So this is, another scientist looking to see, does DNA really back up the tree of life? Again, no. There's another concept, something called orphan genes. And this means basically every different type of organism, humans, chimps, cats, dogs, different kinds of, I'm not sure as much in trees and that, but all these things have hundreds or thousands of unique genes that are only found in them. We have hundreds of genes and proteins in us that chimps don't have. And if we evolved from chimps, we would expect we would have basically the same things they have with just variations, rather than all these totally new genes that they don't have. And chimps have things that we don't have. And if you look at all these different kinds of organisms, you find that they seem to come in clumps, and they have unique things that even the closest looking animals to them are missing. So what's happening is, if evolution is true and we evolved from chimps and we have all these new things, evolution is really happening too fast if all these things popped into existence in just the few million years that humans evolved from chimps. But on the other hand, we have these things called ultra-conserved elements. And this is something, I could do a whole talk on this. This is one of the most mind-blowing things that most people who believe in evolutionists who are scientists aren't aware of. That there are these long gene segments of 200 or more DNA bases, A, C, G, T, that are exactly the same in humans, rats, and mice. And the longest of these are 700 letters that are exactly the same, meaning the DNA, if I could take DNA from one of you and compare it to a mouse or a rat, I would find the same section of 700 DNA letters that's exactly the same in you as in a mouse and in a rat. And yet, evolution says that these organisms have evolved almost 100 million years ago. Rats and humans diverged in the so-called evolutionary tree. That means for 100 million years, 90 to 100 million years, there has been no change in this gene, but everything else has undergone massive change. And in fact, one of the papers I was reading about this, they said the prediction of finding even one of these things of 200 letters long is less than 1 in 10 to the minus 22nd. That's 10,000 billion billion. That's so unlikely to find one, and yet we have hundreds of them. And some of them are 700 bases long, which the odds would be massively less than 1 in 10 to the minus 22. So it's totally unexpected that you would find this stuff. When this came out, it's like, whoa, this is a huge thing, but you don't hear about it because it totally contradicts what evolution would predict, that there's continual gradual change. That these structures are so incredibly precise. For one thing, how did they form in the first place if it was by random chance to get these 700 letters so perfect and then, to not change over all this time. So in this case, evolution's happening too slowly. So you got orphan genes that are popping into existence, evolution's happening super fast, and then you got orphan genes that haven't changed in 100 million years, even by one letter. So it's just two things are happening that go against the standard evolutionary gradual random change. And in fact, it turns out that there are some of these things, that there's a pufferfish which supposedly diverged from humans 450 million years ago, and we have some genes that are almost identical to what are in these pufferfish. Why could something be so perfectly fit for a pufferfish and also a human being? It just makes no sense how these things have not changed in hundreds and even 450 million years. And so another thing about evolution, does every genetics back stuff up? Mitochondrial DNA. This is an interesting thing. Sweeping gene survey reveals new facets of evolution. Now, mitochondrial DNA is only passed down from mother to child. It's because it's not part of the nucleus where you have most of your DNA. It's actually within the cell. Each mitochondria has a small piece of DNA that cause these little organelles to reproduce and produce the key proteins that were the ATPase that we saw that's spinning around. Those are on the mitochondria. So mitochondrial DNA is responsible for these. Well, mitochondrial DNA has some very interesting things. And I'll just read the part in yellow. The study's most startling result is that 9 out of 10 species on Earth today, including humans, came into being 100,000 to 200,000 years ago or less, because the mitochondrial DNA within any species has not changed much at all. If it had been around for millions or billions of years, or hundreds of millions of years, there would have been, expect massive differences in the mitochondrial DNA. But they say it's been 100,000 years as a drop in the scale, and really not far off from 10,000 years or 5,000 years. It's not tens of millions or hundreds of millions. So this is the thing, that mitochondrial DNA shows that every little group of animals is basically very recent in origin. In fact, the researchers said, this conclusion is very surprising, and I fought against it as hard as I could. And so one of the other things, he says, another unexpected finding from the study, species have very clear genetic boundaries, and there's nothing much in between. Humans and chimps, it's not like we're blending into it. It's very clear. You can look at the mitochondrial DNA and know this is a human, this is a chimp, no doubt. It says, if individuals are stars, the species are galaxies. They are compact clusters in the vastness of empty sequence space. So it's like, humans are one galaxy, chimps are another galaxy with vast interstellar distances between us. So the absence of in-between species is something that also perplexed Darwin. And so mitochondrial DNA backs that up rather than supporting Darwin. Excuse me, let me get a quick drink here. And finally, not finally, but excuse me, next, junk DNA. And this is Richard Dawkins in 2009 again, and his Greatest Show on Earth book, The Evidence for Evolution. He wrote this: it's a remarkable fact that the greater part, 95% in the case of humans, of the genome might as well not be there for all the difference it makes. These pseudogenes, or junk DNA, they're genes that once did something useful but now have been sidelined or are never translated or transcribed. What pseudogenes are useful for is embarrassing creationists. It stretches even their creative ingenuity to make up a convincing reason why an intelligent designer should have created a pseudogene unless he was deliberately setting out to fool us. Here he's saying 95% of our DNA is useless junk, and the only thing it's good for is embarrassing creationists. So this is total proof of evolution, because evolution predicts it's all random chance. Most of it's going to be junk, and a little bit, 5% is useful, but that's enough. And that junk proves that evolution did it, not an intelligent creator. But it turns out, just because Richard Dawkins didn't know what that DNA did, and what a lot of other evolutionists who use the term junk DNA, doesn't mean that it really didn't have a function. It was just their ignorance that in their ignorance, they called it junk. It turns out you don't just have to make the proteins. You don't just need to have the information of how to put the beads on the protein string. You need to know when to make the proteins, how much of each protein to make. Each cell in our body has different proteins that are made at different types. And also in response to environmental factors, and when you eat things or when you're dehydrated, all the things change. The DNA has to respond to the environment and trigger making something or turning something else off. All that part is not necessarily making proteins, it's regulating proteins. And you think about it, one of the other things that's totally amazing, each one of us came from a single microscopic cell. When the egg and sperm met and formed that one zygote, too small for us to see unless you had a really, really, really good microscope, it had all the DNA you will ever have in that one cell. But it was just one cell. And now today, it's developed into the complex organism we are. How did it know how to do that? That's encoded in the DNA as well, the junk that Dawkins said you could throw away. And then you get other kinds of things. A lot of the DNA is just the structure of the DNA, the chromosome itself, centromeres, telomeres. A lot of that, it doesn't make proteins, but it's essential to how DNA works in your body. For example, we have over 200 different cell types. Nervous system cells, you have cells in your retina, colon, pancreas, pituitary. These are general terms. Then there's very narrow, specific subtypes of these cells. Each one of these cell types has different kinds of the DNA turned on and turned off. And so all that is the junk DNA, what they call junk, allows all these different cell types to exist. And then putting those cell types into systems. So you have your respiratory system, your muscular system, reproductive system, nervous system, all of that organization of how cells need to connect together. That's controlled indirectly through your DNA, making proteins and doing things at the right time. So all that they call junk, you wouldn't have had any of this unless you had that junk DNA. So, and in fact, here's even an article that came out recently, Scientific American, is junk DNA what makes humans unique? Because one of the great mysteries is, how does our brain form? Remember, we came from one cell that formed all the different muscles and heart and kidney and colon and your brain. And the brain is such a complex, subtle organism. A lot of that subtle DNA, we don't even know how it works, but the brain development is such a miraculous process. Certainly, the DNA is playing a major role in that, but at a very subtle level, it's difficult for us to know. And so just because we don't understand how it's working, it's clearly doing something to make our brains work. So now, Richard Dawkins, 4 years later, after saying it's a fact that our DNA is mostly junk and it's only useful for embarrassing creationists, here's what he's in an interview or a debate with a rabbi in England. So whereas, this is Richard Dawkins' own words, whereas we thought that only a minority of the genome was doing something, namely that minority which actually codes for protein, and now we find that actually the majority is doing something, I've noticed that there are some creationists who are jumping on these results because they think that's awkward for Darwinism. Quite the contrary, it's exactly what a Darwinist would hope for, to find usefulness in the living world. Don't read my previous book where I said it's a fact that it's mostly useless and only good for embarrassing creationists. Well, how dare the creationists criticize me? This is utter hypocrisy, that unless you really knew what Dawkins had just written a few years before, you might slip by. But this is total hypocrisy and lying and covering up. His predictions of evolution 4 years ago were overturned by this. And creationists have a right to say, hey, this is not what you predicted. You're lying when you said this is what evolution would have predicted. You're lying. And so it's just an interesting observation. So again, you've seen different things, the skeletons lined up and all these. Again, this is just pure similarity. And actually, a lot of these skeletons you can read about were put together in order to make them look to fit their chain of things. And at the bottom, I realized this picture was years ago. That is not Joe Biden. It may look like him. On the right, that is not him. So, but it does have a remarkable similarity there. So this ultimately gets to the big issue here. Are we 99% identical with chimps? And this is the kind of stuff you read in the popular science and even in textbooks and things like that. As predicted by preliminary studies, the human and chimpanzee genetic codes are essentially 99% identical, a testament to how fundamentally similar the two species remain, and a proof that we evolved from apes is inherent in that claim. Here's another one, Catherine Pollard in Scientific American, 2009. The humbling truth, we're 99% identical. And here she writes, I was eager to line up the human and DNA sequence next to the chimp. A humbling truth emerged. Our DNA blueprints are nearly 99% identical to theirs. That is, of the 3 billion letters that make up the human genome, only 15 million of them, less than 1%, have changed in the 6 million years or so since humans and chimps diverged. But that was in 2009. She apparently didn't read much of the scientific literature. 2 years before, relative differences, the myth of 1%. This is in a scientific journal, not Scientific American or a newsletter. But how researchers are finding on top of the 1.5% distinction she's talking about, there's chunks of missing DNA that are not counted by those people. There's extra genes, altered connections in the gene networks, and the very structure of chromosomes confound any quantification of humanness versus chimpness. There's a large degree of complexity of how we're different. There isn't one single way to express the genetic divergence between humans and chimps. And then in the article within, it talks about the 6.4% difference, not 1.5%, 6.4%, which is still doesn't seem like a lot, but it is huge, and we'll get into that later. In addition, just the overall composition, we talked about mitochondrial DNA showing that there has been very little evolution within humans and any species. We're all relatively young as a species. The male Y chromosome, which only men have and pass on, it's only coming from father to son throughout from the beginning. And it says chimpanzee and human Y chromosomes are remarkably different than what was expected. And the prediction was theories of genetic decay would predict that the chimpanzee and human gene, the Y chromosomes, should have changed very little since their separation just 6 million years ago. But the findings, they differ radically in sequence structure and gene content. There's extraordinary divergence of the chimpanzee and human, and there's wholesale renovation in the Y chromosome of males compared to that of chimps. And it says, indeed, at 6 million years of separation, the difference that we see between chimps and humans in the Y chromosomes is more comparable to the overall gene difference between chickens and humans, which is over 300 million years ago. So it's not like, oh, this is exactly what we'd predict. The human Y chromosome is very similar to chimp because we're only 6 million years diverged. No, it's as if it was 300 million. It's vastly different. I mean, we're probably, like I say, what you'd expect us to be compared to a chicken is how we are compared to the chimp in the Y chromosome. 50 times more difference than what they expected. And by the way, anybody know what this is? Picture of? Chromosomes, right. And this is like when somebody mentioned trisomy. If you have an extra chromosome, there would be another one of these chromosomes here. You have 23 pairs of chromosomes. You got one chromosome from your mother of each of the 23 and one from your father. Now, the one difference is you got a Y chromosome. If you're a male, you got a Y from the father and an X from your mother. Women got 2 X chromosomes, one from their father and one from their mother. But anyway, we all have roughly something like this if the chromosomes are all connected or closed up together and not being used in functioning. But let me go here. So at this point, hopefully you all grabbed one of those handouts. This is what I'm going to talk about here. Those chromosomes here contain your genetic information. And this page represents an actual portion of the DNA sequence which is in each one of us. I mentioned that PKU, that it's in Diet Coke, that they warn on Diet Coke and Diet Pepsi. This is part of that gene, 5,000 letters here. And each one of us have this, probably this exact sequence within us. And some things about the DNA. You've got those 23 pairs of chromosomes, 3 billion letters from your mother, or 3 billion of the bases from your mother, another 3 billion, a little over that. So over 6 billion DNA bases altogether. So if we printed out your genetic code, every cell of your body has the complete code. If I take a skin cell, every time you type on a keyboard, 400 skin cells come off on the keyboard. Did you? So that's why you should wipe it down if you're on a public keyboard. But every time you type it, that's how tiny your cells are, 400. But each one of those cells has the complete DNA sequence. And if we took any one of those cells, we would get all 6 billion of the letters in it. And so let's say I took one cell from your body, any one of the cells, and I sequence it out, and I wanted to print out the sequence like this. I should be able to do that. You would need 1.2 million pages to print the DNA information in any one cell of your body. And every cell of your body, 10 trillion cells, all have a complete copy of this. In fact, if you printed these out, and I didn't have enough paper, so I didn't do this, so my apologies, and you laid them end to end, it would stretch, and I have this information back on here. Let's see if we have, do I have it up here too? If you took the DNA in one cell, the actual chemical is 6 feet long, by the way. But if you printed this out end to end, it would be 208 miles long, and the printout. So you could go from here to Phoenix and almost all the way back with a strip of your DNA code that's in every one of the cells of your body. Isn't that phenomenal? And sometimes one letter change could cause a serious defect, either heart disease or blindness or stroke, risk of this or that, or just cause you to die in childbirth. And interesting, if you took all the actual chemical DNA in your body, I don't recommend doing this. If you took all the DNA out of your cells, of all the 10 trillion cells of your body, and stretched it end to end, the actual chemical DNA in your body would go 10 billion miles. That's all coiled up inside of you. 10 billion miles, that's 100 times to the sun and back. That's a vast amount of information. But that's how complicated we are, and that's how much information it takes for us to work. This is mind-boggling. And for evolution, well, it makes a little change here, and 100 years later, another little change here. No, we've got vast amounts of information that there's no way that random, unguided processes could make little tweaks and build up this amount of useless functional information that's not 95% junk. It's probably 99.9% useful. And so the real human-chimp difference, 1%, that seems so close. Well, it turns out Nature, the one actually was saying it was 3.9%. That would mean, if you wanted the human-chimp difference, 23,000 pages like this. That's the difference between humans and chimps, if it's a 3.9% difference. And science said it's up to 6.4%. That would mean 122,000 pages like this. So when they say, oh, humans and chimps are almost the same, yeah, if you want to print 122,000 pages of the difference and say that's very little, that's a massive amount of difference. So, and in fact, even if it's 1%, you would still have 5,000 pages like this. That's vastly, it's not something that could happen by random chance in just a few 100,000 generations. So the question is, how did these massive sequences get together? And evolutionists, and when I was an atheist and an evolutionist, this was the answer. This is the God of evolution. Given enough time, anything can happen. But is that really true? And so here, is Bella around? I need my volunteer. So, all right, let's give a hand to our volunteer. And I asked Pastor Bill, where do you normally roll dice and do your gambling in this church? And he said, oh, anywhere is fine. So we're just going to do it. Well, and what I'm going to do here, you can stay right there, Bella, okay? And I have $100 here, 250s. And if Bella rolls all ones, I'll give her a couple tries. Should I give her a couple tries? If she can roll all ones with these, I will give her this $100, okay? So hold your hands up. What was that? No? Oh, no, I'll tell you. No, you got one. Let's roll them on the floor here so everyone can see them, okay? Because it's hard to see them on the chart here. Yeah. No, that's fine. This is her first. This shows you it's unrehearsed. So, and these are ordinary normal dice. So you could roll. So you can just drop them right in front of you here. Yeah. It's hard to hold 12 in your hand. There you go. Okay, go ahead and drop these two. Did you get all ones? Oh, two, and roll those two. You got two more. Okay. Let's do one more try. Here, you hold your hands out, and I'll put them in there for you. You just hold your hands out, and I'll put them all in. Good. You're doing great so far. Okay, and now let's see. Let's all ones. Go ahead, Bella. And, oh my gosh, not one. But let's give her a big hand, though. Thanks, Bella. Could you put those together for me and just put them back up here while I'm talking? Thank you. She did a great job, though. That was without any practice. So, and I've done this before, and I've had other kids come up. Has anyone ever won? And I have to confess that she didn't really have a whole big chance of winning, because it turns out if you're talking about the Mega Millions Lotto, you have a 1 in 300 million chance of getting that right. We had a $1 billion winner on October 23rd, 2018. But with 12 dice, it's six. Each dice has 6 possibilities. 6 times 6 times 6. So $1,000 winner or $100 winner, the chances are 1 in 2 billion. So unfortunately, she was more likely to win the Mega Million lottery by picking a number many times more likely, 7 times more likely to win that than to roll 12 ones. That's only 12 dice, 12 positions. In fact, it would take, if I handed her the dice every second and she rolled every second, day and night, it would take 34 years for her to have a 50-50 chance of getting all ones. So I'm pretty safe with, I normally say $1,000, but I didn't have $1,000 to bring, so I just reduced it to $100. So if she had done it, I would have given it to her, and I would have been shocked. But like I say, the most I've seen is 4 ones. The average is going to be 2, and she got a 0 that time and a 2 the other time, so that's about par. So anyway, so we're talking now rolling dice. Given enough time, anything can happen. Well, it'll take 34 years just to get 12 ones. That's a very simple thing. What about this DNA, the sheet of DNA? If you hold that up, getting just the first, 200 DNA bases. And we talked about those ultra-conserved elements. We have some sequences of 200 DNA bases that are the same in humans and chimps and mice, or humans and rats and mice. So these sequences actually exist in nature that are precisely defined. How likely is it? Well, that's the equivalent. This is a bag of 150 dice. And I won't have Bella roll this because it would take me all day to collect them up. And I'll just tell you how this works. If I said, I'll give you $1 trillion if you roll all ones, the unlikelihood of doing that, given enough time, and would you be able to do it? Because evolution says, well, given enough time, anything can happen. I would have said that years ago. Given enough time, anything can happen. We don't have infinite time because they say, well, the universe is at most 13.7 or 13.8 billion years old since the Big Bang. So you don't have forever, only 13.8 billion years. And you don't have enough. You say, well, what if I have multiple people do it? Well, what if you not just have people do it? You have every proton in the universe roll dice. Make really tiny dice so that every proton does it. And you don't do it every second. You do it the fastest amount of time we can measure, which is a million billion times a second. Every proton, a million billion times a second rolling dice for 13.8 billion years, the entire lifetime of the universe. What are the chances of you're going to getting all ones? Well, it turns out that it's the number of particles in the universe times the smallest increment of time. You could do 10 followed by 113 zeros. That's how many attempts they would be able to get. They'd be able to roll the dice 10 to the 113th times. So that's the maximum number of events, and that's being pretty generous because I don't think protons can really roll dice. But assuming they could, that's super generous. Well, to get the 150 dice, the number of possibilities is, 2 times 5 times 10 to the 120th, there's 25 million more possibilities of rolling just 150 dice than there are of all those protons rolling dice for all of the time of the universe as fast as you could possibly conceive it happening. So even this little bag of 150 dice disproves the statement, given enough time, anything can happen. Because you cannot roll all the combinations of this dice. There's not enough time. There's not enough particles. It just cannot, even something this simple could not happen by random chance. And what turns out to be those 150 dice are the equivalent of just getting 200 DNA bases. That's the probability because there's 4 ways of doing DNA bases and 6 ways of doing a die. It turns out that it takes 200 DNA bases is actually just a little bit more, but about the same as 150 dice. So if you can't roll 150 dice, you can't even get 200 DNA bases in a precise sequence by random chance by just rolling those dice. So evolution maybe can't explain that, that this never happens. Maybe evolution doesn't need precise sequences of 200, but we have those ultra-conserved elements that some of them have 700 exactly the same that haven't changed for supposedly hundreds of millions of years. And so that's the kind of thing that evolution can't explain. That modern genetics doesn't back up the tree of life or that humans evolved from apes. It's just we're too complicated. Time and chance can't explain it. And just I'd like to quickly go through this last one. Evolution in science has no explanation for human consciousness. And with that, I'm going to start. I have 3 things here. This is a lump of charcoal from a fireplace or a little grill, charcoal briquette. Here's my water. Actually, I have a full bottle here so I don't want to cheat you on the water. A full bottle of water. And this is some actual yard fertilizer. So if I take these 3 things and I mix them up, what can I make out of it? Now, if somebody's from TSA here, they'd probably say explosives. And probably you could if you have the fertilizer and the charcoal. You might be able to, depending on what kind of fertilizer you had. But actually, these are the ingredients of your brain. You have hydrogen and oxygen in the water, carbon, which is in protein, DNA, sugars, and fats, and a bunch of salts, sodium, potassium, sulfur, nitrogen, a few other. With these chemical elements are the only things that make up your brain. Now, maybe this isn't the exact ratio, but the stuff is here. And if I had enough of it, I could duplicate the exact contents of your brain. The question is this any bit conscious, the water? Does it have any self-awareness? Is there any thoughts going on in this? No. What about the charcoal briquette? No. The fertilizer? No. They're just atoms that have no semblance of consciousness in any way whatsoever. Whoop. My bottle kind of collapsed on me there, but. So the question is, how is it then, if these elements make up your brain, how does consciousness come about? Now, we've done all kinds of amazing studies over the last 100 years, in particular with MRI instruments. By the way, MRI, how many of you ever had an MRI for anything at all? That was invented by a creation scientist named Ray Damadian. And there was a big issue that he should have won a Nobel Prize because two people after him who made minor changes and improved some things on he invented the whole concept of doing MRI. And then there were a couple scientists who did some mathematical changes that improve it a little bit here and there. They got Nobel Prizes, but he did not. And the big issue is he was a creationist, and they didn't want to honor a creationist with a Nobel Prize for one of the greatest medical discoveries of time. But anyway, we know a lot about the brain and everything like that. In all the different regions, because of people who've had brain damage. Some of the studies where a construction worker had a spike go through his skull and he lived, and they determined what part of his brain were damaged because he had various effects. And so, if this part of the brain is destroyed, you can't speak or you can't hear or this or that. So that's unfortunately trial and error is how a lot of these things were figured out. And we know a lot about the chemistry of nerve cells and all these kind of things like that. And we can do brain waves. We can put electrodes on and measure electricity going through the brain. So, we know a lot of things when people are sleeping and awake and stuff like that. And there's various other things we've done I won't get into things, where they do psychology experiments to study how people think and stuff. In fact, here's just some of the things. If you stare at the middle circle there, do any of you see black dots popping up here and there? If you stare at one of those dots. Maybe you have to get closer here. But it's some of these optical illusions. There's all kinds of really cool things. It's like, wow, I didn't know the brain worked that way. And they have terminologies for how various optical systems in your eye work. But the thing is, we have not begun to explain perceptions or thoughts, what we're thinking. And there's a term for it they call qualia, which is the subjective experiences that we each have on our own. That includes things like vision, light, color, brightness, sounds, what touch feels like, taste, smell. All of these things are interpretations or phenomena that occur within our consciousness. They're not things you can actually measure, other than somebody self-reporting back, yes, I see a red apple, yes, I hear this sound, or yes, I feel this. You can't put probes on their brain and say, he's thinking of a red apple, or he's thinking of a blue triangle. We can't do that. There's no way of having that happen. And then there's feelings, thoughts, emotions, all that. And again, we have no explanation how these individual atoms that have no consciousness whatsoever, when they get connected into these massive networks, poof, suddenly you have this miracle of consciousness and self-awareness and vision. I was talking to somebody earlier, how do you explain color? Explain the difference between red and green to a person who's blind from birth. You can't do that. We can't do that. It's just something that it can't be done. But we take for granted, and even sound. How would you describe sound to somebody who's been deaf from birth? Or, all these various phenomena. We just have no explanation. How do these particles experience this? And even though you have trillions of atoms in your brain, you have one single consciousness. Your singularity of consciousness. That's a mystery too. How does that happen? So all these things, it turns out one of the most important things of our existence, our consciousness, science today has no explanation for. And you don't read about that in textbooks, that, we just all evolved and poof, consciousness just somehow, it gave a selective advantage. But flying elephants that shoot x-rays would give a selective advantage too, but that didn't happen. Why, how did this miraculous phenomena of consciousness occur? And with that, other than your own personal conscious experience, how can you prove that you know that you're conscious or anyone else. And I just want to ask this: if you had a totally paralyzed but mentally normal person, how would you tell if or what that person was thinking? They could not move, they could not respond in any way. How would you know what was going on? You wouldn't. And this is not just a thought experiment. This goes back a few years. Many of you probably remember the story of Terri Schiavo, who had I forget what happened that caused her to go into a coma, and eventually her husband pulled her off life support. He did get money out of her and that was a big fight of whether she should be kept alive or not. Some people claim that they sensed that she, made some responses to them, but, the medical community said no, she was brain dead. Well, it turns out, here's an article, a man trapped in coma for 23 years was awake the whole time. Here's a guy who was in a coma, suddenly got revived, and he was saying during that whole time, he heard what people were saying and doing. He could feel what they were doing to his body, but he was paralyzed in this coma state. He could not respond. It was like hell. And then finally somebody realized he could make a twitching of a finger or something like that, and he was able to communicate, type things, and they could, he could see things around him, but he could not respond in any way. And then there's another book published by numerous people. This happened up to 20% of the cases of people in coma turn out later to be revived and say they were conscious that whole time. So this is the thing. We don't know what's going on in the brain of another person, and it is a serious thing when somebody's paralyzed and can't respond and tell you, yes, I am hearing and seeing what you're saying, even though I can't respond in any way. So anyway, consciousness is a powerful argument for dualism, that there's a difference between soul and matter. There's particles and stuff. Our brain is made of particles, but that's not our spirit or our consciousness. And interesting, this is the only verse I mentioned, but I love this one. For who knows a person's thoughts except their own spirit within them? In the same way, no one knows the thoughts of God except the Spirit of God. This is written, by Paul 2,000 years ago, and it's just as true today. Who knows the thoughts within you other than yourself? And with that, I just won't go through, but you have the 5 dirty little secrets. And just to mention, I'm not the only PhD scientist who thinks this way on these things. There's over, I think, 1,200 signers now. This is Discovery Institute, a scientific descent from Darwinism, who are PhD-level scientists all over the world, including some, I think one was a Nobel Prize winner, and there's others, National Academy of Sciences, and top scientists all over. Certainly a minority, no question about that, but not just 1 or 2 or a few quacks, but thousands of top people. And like I say, there's some books if you're interested. And if you have any questions or if you want to give these handouts to other people, I could email you a PDF of these. So if you want to distribute them to anybody else, just email me. The email's also on the bottom, cw@5dirtylittlesecrets.com, and I will get that to you. So anyway, thanks for your time tonight, or this morning. Okay, let's do you have a few questions there? Yes. Mm-hmm. Hmm. Yeah. Any other questions you had in the back?
Bring up your randomization thing with the dice.
Yes.
I'm not really a fan of that because it is possible to roll 12 ones, although the probability is like lacking. I get that. But we have 7.5 billion people on this planet. And when you live in a rural area like this, your chances of meeting, a certain individual from another world, another culture, and another nation, especially a nation that they're not even allowed to leave, is probably a higher odd than rolling 12 dice.
Well,
Number.
let's talk about the 150 dice, though, because 12 dice is so simple it's nothing, but 150 dice is just 200 DNA bases, which,
I'm from China that I met. He was from the communist country China, from Canton. He came over here as a slave, actually, and was working in a kitchen in Prescott. And the triads had set him up with a job in a Chinese restaurant here. And he told me all about it. He didn't even know about Tiananmen Square. I mean, he lived.
but maybe just for the sake of people here, if we can get to the dice or the probability, yes.
500 million people.
Mm-hmm.
And now he's a good friend of mine. But the thing is the randomization, I don't think, because you're looking at, we need to score on this dice, and we're going to roll until we do. And yeah, you've got a long sequence to get to it. It's going to take a lot of rolls. When you're doing it on dice, it's not going to happen the first time, or it could. See, that's the thing. It's randomization. And that's what I'm getting at.
Well, I would totally,
Like-
yeah. Right, and that though that is a likely probability compared to the 150 dice is a vastly, I mean, this is like you say the amount. Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah, yes, right. Well, the question is, did it come about by pure random chance? And as the odds, and that's the issue. Obviously, I agree we came about, and we have these amazingly complex sequences. I'm saying that the probability that it came about by unguided random chance is so remotely small that and anything else in the world, you're not going to expect that your car is going to run without gasoline, yeah. We know a lot more than he did, though. That's the issue. Though. Yes, over here. Yes.
Bible did, he knows about diabetes and dirt, and so God can do it. That has nothing to do with it.
Right. We are here. We know that. Yes. See, rolling those dice. Yes. Yeah, because the odds are, yeah, that's where Pascal and a lot of the mathematics came about through probability of gambling. Yes. Yes, ma'am. Oh, go ahead. Yes. It's chemical bonds, yes. So that's the thing is, it goes back to the fine-tuning of the universe, created carbon atoms with the precise properties they have to form these bonds. And apart from carbon, there's no chemical elements. If you remove carbon from the picture and look at all the other elements, the 92 natural ones, none of them can form compounds of more than a couple hundred at maximum. And that's silicon can do, I think, 600 or so. And those are very unstable, and they only are formed in a laboratory. But when you throw carbon in the mix, you have human chromosome number 1 has, I believe, something like 8 billion atoms in one molecule. And it's because that's how much information is in there. It takes these billions of connections to form, and they're all chemical, and they're held tightly together so that they don't fall apart in most cases. But at the same time, your body can add to it, remove from it, and modify it, break it down. So it's strong enough, but not too strong. It's just right. And that's the whole thing with chemistry. You can't have bonds that are so tight that you can't ever be broken down. Life requires things to be able to be built up, to be taken apart, as necessary to be digested, to be built, and yet have that stability. And that's miraculous. It's just right. Any other questions, or also hand it back? If anyone has anything else, I'll do one more, and then I'll just hang around. If you have questions, you can come up to me afterward. Yes? No, they've observed that through X-ray diffraction and that because when the reality is your DNA is actually, most of it is folded up because, like I say, you have, that, how many say 100 billion miles of the DNA molecule are rolled up in your body. That keeps it very compact, and little bits of it get unwound, and knowing how to unwind it, that's part of the junk DNA too. because it's like, oh, I need this protein. I've got to unwind it, copy the part I need, then wind it back up. Because if your DNA were unwound and not compact in that double helix all folded up in the chromosomes, your body wouldn't have room for it. So just the management of that information is mind-boggling. But yeah, it's the double helix does exist, and we can confirm that, not by eyesight and not even by visual light, but by X-rays, which have narrower wavelengths, and you can actually see the patterns that we can reliably know that they are bound together and that the DNA bases match up with each other, and it all makes sense chemically, and that's how life depends on that fact. So, but anyway, I'll leave it to Dave, and I'll be over here if anyone needs me afterwards.